Mic test, 1, 2. Sounds good? Yeah, sounds good to me too. Blessed night. Allow me to greet you in the divine name of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I and Empress Menen, to our great ancestors, the great gods and goddesses of this ancient, black, eternal race. It gives me pleasure, it gives me joy to welcome ones and ones here tonight to this special, and I say a special gathering. As an African people, we always invoke the presence of the Most High in everything that we do. And so I'm going to call on Brother Marcus, the chairman of the One Love Rastafari movement, just to bring in some opening noises, a prayer and a chant, and then we get into the rest of the program. Brother Marcus.
I want to greet everybody in the name of His and Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I and Empress Menen Asfa. How good and how pleasant it is for brethren and sisters to come together in perfect love and harmony. It's like a precious ointment upon our head, even upon our head, the locks and beard went down to the skirts of our garments. As the dew of her which was descended upon the mountain of Zion, for the Most High, King Haile Selassie, I command His blessing, and I should have life, guidance, and protection, even forevermore. For Haile I, Selassie I, King Rastafari, Empress Menen I, great ancestors I, great gods and goddess of the ancient, and black I, eternal race. I just want to give thanks for the gathering tonight. Welcome everybody to such a special occasion. Is another activity within our liberation for the mind of our black people. So I hope everybody will enjoy themselves tonight as we listen to Dr. Soomer, as she bless us with her inspiration. Yes, I have.
So I give thanks, Brother Marcus. African Liberation Day. That's why we're here tonight. African Liberation Day, May 25th. That was on Saturday. And tonight we are celebrating African Liberation Day in another form. But you may ask yourself, what is African Liberation Day? How is it important to I and I? Why is it important to I and I? How does it fit into the everyday scheme of things? And by right, a very important question, because when we look back at what African Liberation Day meant and was supposed to be and why it came about, and we look at our conditions today, it really makes us wonder. One of the things that we find lacking is education. And most of the times, we behave a little ignorant because we just don't know. And so it is important for I and I at this time, not just in our lives, but for the whole existence of our black race, that we take things like African Liberation Day to the fullness of its importance and never stop celebrating them. We must educate the minds of our youths as to what African Liberation Day is all about. Because it never stops. It continues up until this afternoon, this evening. Our ancestors never gave up. It wasn't on the plantation that they started to revolt. Some of them never even got onto the ship because of the resistance they put up. When we look at what is happening today in terms of our politics and our so-called small island politics, and more shamefully, the form of democracy that we tend to be living in, the way it classifies us as a people, the way the system has us graded according to race, and as such you get your portion likewise. That kind of mentality has to change. And it could only change when our people know what they've been through over the years, what their forefathers and ancestors had to sacrifice for us to be here today looking so nice and lovely, all dressed down and celebrating, what they had to give up. And as such, we owe it to our ancestors. We owe it to our children. We owe it to our future generation to never let the vision of festivals like African Liberation Day, never to let them die. Blessed love. I want to call on my granddaughter. I want to call on Star to bless us with a poem. Let's put our hands together and welcome Star.
Good night, everyone. My name is Kajne, also known as Star, and I have a wonderful poem for you. I am the black child. I am special. Ridicule can't sway me. I am strong. Obstacles can't stop me. I hold my head high, proudly proclaiming my uniqueness. I hold my pace, continuing through adversity. I am proud of my culture and my heritage. I am confident that I can achieve my every goal. I am becoming all that I can be. I am the black child, and I am a child of God. Thank you.
Shining Star. Let's hear it again for Star. Yeah, man, identifying as black, you know? Very important. Very important that we know who we are. Blackness. And now I want to take us back, but yet forward. You know, Rastas have this mystical way of speaking, you know? We say things just different. We don't go back to Africa, we go forward to Africa. You know, we keep it on a positive. But I want to take us back a little, back to the drums. Because when we hear the drums, and we remember the drums, and as to what the drums were really for, it will really set the pace and the tone for tonight. Put your hands together and welcome Elder Ras Bingi Harris to bless us with the African drum.
Greetings to sis over here. I would like to say, yes, I would like to say greetings to sis. Welcome to Nevis, Wali. And I would like to say also to you, Fonga, Alafia, Ashe, Ashe, which means welcome. One more. Calypso. African kind of way. So and regular calypso.
You ever hear this saying, the man make the drum talk? He made it talk, man. Let's hear it again for us, Bingy. The talking drum. Actually, one of the main purposes of the drum, used back then to send messages from one people to the other, from one tribe to the other. You can sit in Charlestown and I can send you a message in Fig Tree. How wonderful, That's the heights that our people once lived on. Give thanks to us, Bingy, for that wonderful rendition on the drum. Talking drum. And now we're getting close to, I don't want to say meat, because Rasta stay far from the meat. We're getting close to the true essence of why we're here. But you would have seen the term reparations. And by now you must have associated that same term with why we're here tonight. Reparations. And even though we didn't touch on it earlier, but it does fit quite well into the whole African liberation process. But what is reparations? I'm sure Dr. Soomer will enlighten you to the fullness as to what it's all about. But just allow me to just read something that CARICOM put together as to what reparation is. And it says, reparation is the process of repairing the consequences of crimes committed and the attempt to reasonably remove debilitating effects of such crimes upon victims and their descendants. So reparation seeks reconciliation between victims and beneficiaries. It is non-confrontational and conciliatory. Reparation seeks to restore equity in social relations, equality, and justice before the law. Reparation seeks to heal. It seeks to atone and bring closure to the human tragedy of mass slavery. It seeks finally to restore a higher moral order by removing the shame and the guilt that persistently poison relations between descendants on all sides of the crime. We'll hear a lot more in depth as to what reparation entails. I will now call on Ms. J.D. Keynes to introduce our guest speaker. Let's welcome Ms. Keynes.
Good night, all. Notice he introduced my daughter as his granddaughter, and he made no mention that I am his child. I'm his daughter. That's how grandparents are. Honorable Ambassador Dr. June Soomer has diverse experiences through her work in the diplomatic, financial, and education sectors, obtained through over 30 years of academic and professional experience functioning at the managerial, operational, and technical levels. She has a sound understanding of contemporary development issues, and she continues to advocate for equality and equity in sustainable development. Dr. Soomer is the first woman to serve as St. Lucian Plenipotentiary Ambassador to CARICOM and the OECS with responsibility for diaspora affairs, as an OECS commissioner, and was the Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, ACS. She has received numerous awards in the areas of diplomacy, regionalism, development, and leadership. Her publications are on regional integration, cricket, issues on enslaved women and women of African descent, emancipation, reparation, and the work of Nobel laureate Arthur Lewis. Currently, she serves as the chair of the Global Campus Council of the University of the West Indies, chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, and a member of the St. Lucia Reparations Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Ambassador Dr. June Soomer.
Good evening, all. Let me say what an honor it is to deliver the Africa Day lecture in Kuala. Special thanks to the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, the UWI 5 Islands campus, Mrs. Carla Astafan and the Potter's House, the Reparations Committee of St. Kitts and Nevis, the One Love Rastafarian Movement, and the local organizing committee for their support. Liberation movements in the smallest slave colony in the West Indies, and that is what Nevis was, the smallest slave colony in the West Indies, holds a special fascination for me, as the size of the island and the proximity of planters to the enslaved would have created additional tensions that did not obtain in bigger islands where more land was available. In other words, the enslaved in St. Kitts could feel the planters breathing on them because the island is so small. This dynamic created an underlying pressure. It was like a pressure cooker that made planters always suspicious that there was going to be a rebellion. They had every justification to be suspicious, as the enslaved in Nevis would use all opportunities to escape the oppressive conditions they endured. Of great significance is the fact that the early slave plantations in Nevis in the 1670s and the 1680s were primarily populated by women, very different to other slave frontier societies where men were the ones who came and established the plantations. In Nevis, it was women who dominated the frontier in this country. It tells me that your liberation movements would commence with females in your society, as resistance would have commenced immediately. You know, one of the interesting things, because I do a lot of work on women in enslavement, is that women had very unique ways of resisting enslavement. And so, you know, from the beginning, we were already abusing the planters verbally. And so it's not anything different now. We know exactly what to tell them. The physician and the naturalist Hans Sloane, later founder of the British Museum, visited Nevis in the late 1680s. That's just when slave society started. And he noted that the ground is cleared almost to the top of the hill, where yet remains some wood, and where are runaway Negroes that harbor themselves in it. Yes, the women of Nevis were already establishing these freedom villages that we call maroon societies. During this period, Nevis was the richest of the British Leeward Island colonies, richer than Antigua and Barbuda, richer than St. Kitts, and so on. And so it was no surprise that the Leeward Islands, that when the Leeward Islands were separated from Barbados in 1671, Nevis became the seat of the Leeward Islands colony until 1698. One would have thought that this administrative and military presence would have stymied the growth of liberation movements in the island, but that was not to be. That fight for liberation by the enslaved in both St. Kitts and Nevis, and sometimes I'll say St. Kitts, but the majority of my examples are on Nevis because I like to be very specific when I go to an island. And in the entire region was situated within a freedom ethos that commenced at the beginning of enslavement. Then the thread that connects, and so because you must be wondering how I moved from emancipation to reparations. So there's a thread that connects emancipation and recolonization themes to the liberation and reparatory justice and ultimately the sustainable development and the humanity that we seek. Later in the 19th century, more men would be trafficked, mainly from the Gold Coast and the Gambia. In A Natural History of Nevis and the rest of the English Leeward Caribbean Islands in the Americas, in letters written from Reverend Mr. Smith to a Reverend Mr. Mason, he says, our Negroes, except what was born at Nevis, are brought to us from Guinea. So if you didn't know where your ancestors came from, a lot of them came from Guinea. Those from the Gold Coast being the most valuable and hardy. On account of the vast heats and of course scarcity of provisions there. So they brought people from Guinea because they were more hardy, used to the heat, and also used to working harder. And those of Congo and Angola are less set by because of plenty of provisions in their own temperate and cool countries, renders them lazy and consequently not so able to endure work and fatigue. So they didn't like those from the Congo and Angola, they preferred those from Guinea. So they kept the enslaved in Nevis, hungry and overworked to maintain the wealth of Britain. One of my motivations for this lecture is that there must be an understanding that this fight for liberation is rooted firstly in a desire for Africa. So that's how I make the connection with Africa Liberation Day and Africa Day. For their homeland and that the deliverance of Africa is important to our own freedom and humanity. You should know that the period of the liberation struggles, the period that influenced the establishment of Africa Day, is not over. Instead, the fight for liberation has new dimensions, including some of the things that we hear about presently, like data mining and knowledge manipulation with AI systems. If true emancipation, independence, and liberation are to become realities in the region, we must internalize what Evaristo Benyara refers to as the mutative nature of colonialism. I argue that independence did not mean decolonization. It was an aberration, and that we still live with that terrorism that we call colonialism. The final thing that I want you to get out of this conversation, because I like to tell you what I want you to think about throughout the conversation. So the final thing I want you to get out of this conversation is that the extraction and trafficking of human beings from Africa to the West Indies was state-sponsored and was entrenched in their legal system through laws passed in both the West Indies and in Europe. It was the state, the royals, the elite in both the British and French Europe, and St. Kitts, as St. Kitts had both of them, who hired middlemen, who set them up in companies like the French West India Company and the Royal Africa Company, which was a British company, and who hired corsairs, pirates, and privateers to support this system. Further, that enslavement, emancipation, and colonialism were legal systems controlled from outside the country. There were over 100 laws which accommodated the slave trade and which made slaves property. It would then be justified within their religious systems. So that when John Praetor Pinney, who inherited the estates in Nevis, bought 9 enslaved Africans in St. Kitts, he remarked, and I quote, "Since my arrival, I've purchased 9 Negro slaves at St. Kitts, and can assure you I was shocked at the first appearance of human flesh exposed to sale. But surely God ordained them for ye use and benefit of us. Otherwise, his divine will would have been made manifest by some particular sign or token." In other words, they're saying that they were justified religiously in enslaving us. All the systems then, the economic, the social, the political, and religious, were all contrived to proclaim our inferiority and oppression. All these systems, therefore, have to be decolonized for true liberation. And recall I said earlier that independence didn't mean decolonization. So if independence didn't mean decolonization, it means that all of these systems are still colonial. Okay, emancipation then. In 2022, I presented this in Lucia Emancipation lecture, and I noted, and I quote, that there has been a carefully constructed narrative around the issue of emancipation that has left us with a misplaced gratitude towards our enslavers for a perceived benevolence and generosity that has generated tensions, disharmony, and discord in our liberation process. The result is that we think that emancipation was about a specific date, and that we should just forget about the 300 years of oppression that was inflicted on every facet of our being, unquote. This narrative is in the history that is the history that is taught in our schools. And we continue to perpetuate that these people are our saviors. So we sit and wait for someone to come to our rescue and do not understand that our liberation is in our hands. The fact is that the isms, racism, gradualism, abolitionism, colonialism, and neocolonialism have created the schisms and resulted in a confusion that has hindered mental emancipation and internal healing and internal reparations or repair. We must aim at repairing the damage and affirming our commitment to freeing our minds and moving forward triumphantly. I want to remind you also that of the violence of the system of enslavement, which meant that our liberation was always on our minds. The fact that we were labeled as chattel meant that the fight for human rights and our demand to be justly defined as human, as a person, was always our aim. You know, we are the only people who have ever had to prove that we are human. Do you understand the concept of chattel? Do you understand what it means to own human beings and their offspring as property? How does a human being become a commodity who can be bought, sold, mortgaged, and inherited? Can you understand what it means to have no legal rights or protections? To work for 4 centuries with no wages, and then for your oppressor to say that you were not industrious or you did not work hard enough, that is why your present condition is of your own doing? Can you imagine? As we continue with our commemoration of Africa Day, emphasis must be placed on the enslaved who liberated themselves, for we used every space, every strategy necessary for us to survive the brutality of enslavement. Before the end of the 17th century, towards the close of 1639, slave insurrections broke out in the Capesterre section of St. Kitts because of the brutal treatment, and the enslaved fled to the woods on the slopes of Mount Misery with their women and children, where they established a maroon settlement from which they raided the plantations. This unceasing assault on enslavement would continue into the next century. These resistance movements were met with even more brutality when they failed. In September 1724, a planter informed the Nevis Assembly that, and I quote, "several Negroes in this island run away who daily commit thefts and robbery, and that encouragement should be given to the public to such persons who shall take and apprehend the said Negroes," which encouraged Chief Justice John Descent to suggest that a considerable sum of 2 to 3 pistols be given to anyone who apprehended one of these practitioners of maroonage. A pistol in 1623 was valued at £9. So 9 by 3 or 9 by 2, that's how much they paid for a runaway enslaved person. Yes, planters and others in the society were compensated for returning the enslaved to the plantations or even for killing them. In St. Kitts, they were paid in sugar for these returns. In reality, the assault on the plantations was persistent and a severe threat to the continuation of enslavement, and the economic viability of the plantation system. I want you to recognize the freedom fighter in the narrative of rebellion. You know, they always tell you rebellious, we were rebellious. No, we were freedom fighters. In Nevis, the planters therefore lived in constant fear. In 1725, right after trying to deal with the Maroons, they faced the threat of revolt, real or imagined. It was alleged that a slave conspiracy took place in Nevis in 1725. The island, because of added tensions due to drought and harsh conditions affecting both white planters and the enslaved on the islands, created tension. The plot involved enslaved people conspiring to overthrow the white population and take control of the island for themselves. Governor John Hart intervened by arresting alleged conspirators and sentencing them to death, claiming that this would sufficiently terrify the rest so that they would no longer pose a threat. From the early 1730s, owners of executed enslaved people in Nevis were compensated with cash rather than sugar. The average allowance per slave was 30 pounds. So if you caught an enslaved person who had run away and killed them, you would get 30 pounds cash. The average allowance, and 20 years later, that would be raised to 70 pounds. According to the historical records, the cost of a slave in Nevis during the 17th century varied between 12 and 15 pounds. So we were worth more dead than alive to the planters. Many were executed in Nevis in the same period, and many still continue to run away. And those who committed crimes directly against individual whites were always executed. You know, one of the most interesting things to me, just on an aside, with regard to resistance, is that no matter what level the punishment, we still resisted. We still resisted. So even execution did not stop the liberation movement from happening in Nevis. Records depict the enslaved in Nevis as rebelling against white authority in a variety of ways. In 1734, a slave named Limerick, yesterday I got a very good one from St. Kitts named Marcus. This one is Limerick. The property of James Emra, quote, committed a barbarous murder on the body of John Wattis, Emra's neighbor. So, John Broadbell was paid 10 pistols. Remember I told you a pistol was about 9 pounds. He was paid 10 for recovering Limerick, but the slave, quote, laid violent hands on him and cheated the executioner. In the following year, John Huggins was reimbursed by the Assembly in relation, 30 pounds, in relation to the execution of his unnamed Negro woman, who had allegedly poisoned a white woman. And in 1738, George Webb was granted 70 pounds for a male slave who had burnt down the house of Elizabeth Neal. I use that quotation to show you the variety of ways in which there was resistance. A Cambridge graduate who spent most of the 1730s as the rector of St. John's Parish, Nevis, recorded in his Natural History of Nevis that, and I quote, a parishioner of mine baptized a black woman and had her well instructed in our religion here in England. But she had not long been arrived at St. Kitts before she poisoned 4 white persons and was executed for so doing. So compensation was paid for the killing of that enslaved African, while execution was the lot of the enslaved. So they paid compensation to the planters for their loss, but they executed us. Which is why we must understand that our fight is out for our own liberation is ours, and that it had to be interrupted in order for a colonial master to put in place a system over which they would have control and continue to have control to this day. I would like to draw your attention to the Pan-African response in the region based on liberation as a response to oppression. This was in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution in 1804. You know, we don't take time to look at the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is at the heart of our liberation. And there was a pan-Caribbean response to the Haitian Revolution. It means that across the Caribbean, all of us responded with rebellions in all of the countries. Because for the first time, we realized that through military means, we could take over a country and destroy the plantation system. And that is what Haiti should mean to us, a symbol of freedom. You know, so it really boggles my mind that when Haitians come to our countries, we treat them like pariah, as if they don't belong, when their country was the symbol for us of a pan-Caribbean liberation that lives with us today. To continue to think of resistance and rebellion as black disobedience is to continue to perpetuate the myth of the savage. It's because we were savages that we didn't know how to behave, and so we rebelled. And so to continue to think of rebellion in that term means that we are continuing to think of ourselves as savages. Ladies and gentlemen, we have never accepted that we were not human beings. We have never accepted that we were somebody's property. We have never accepted that was our lot in life. Instead, we became freedom fighters, and we became the descendants of nation builders. For me, one of the most interesting things about emancipation is abolition. So we never knew, for example, that there was a movement in England called the Sons of Africa, who were fighting for emancipation. We always hear about Buxton and Wilberforce and those people who were at the heart of the colonial emancipation, because they didn't want us to know that there were freed people from Africa who were living in England, who were fighting for our cause. You see how connected we are? We don't understand the connection. And until we understand that connection, the fight for Africa will never be complete. We have to be part of that fight. Never forget that the fact that the decline of the plantation system in Nevis was brought about by the fight for freedom. This would soon be replaced at the end of emancipation by a society of small holders who grew fruit and vegetables for their own subsistence. And I'm so happy for that, because then I could get poly mangoes. That's one of my main reasons, apart from this lecture, for coming here. This, according to Douglas Midgett, meant that by the 1930s, that during the 1930s, Nevis was able to weather the Depression. You know, the Great Depression of the 1930s, because you grew your own food. And from then understood the issue of food security. The Depression did not affect you as it affected the other countries in the Caribbean. it meant that trade unions never really took root in Nevis. And that is because of the fact that there was no plantation worker really in place to look at wages and better working conditions. You were already owning your own land and working your own plots. And so this has led to internal consolidation that remains a mark of Nevisian society today. I am hopeful that although I have not gone into the articles of the Emancipation Act, that at this point you would already know or concluded certain things about emancipation. Emancipation then was a conscious step designed to keep us tied to a notion of inferiority as a people. It was a slow and gradual racist process which said that we were incapable of taking care of our own and in need of protection from ourselves. Secondly, the Emancipation Act was designed to appease a prominent set of politicians, European elite, West Indian planters and estate owners, and the ideology which underpinned that domination. And thirdly, it became the blueprint for the continued control of our minds, identity, our culture, our political systems, our environment, our economic and sustainable development systems, our futures, and ultimately our independence. I move now to the issue of recolonization. The Emancipation Act was the first part of the evolution of colonialism, a system designed to consolidate the British Empire and to enforce inequality and subordination. Eric Williams writes, and I quote, "Even then, emancipation was to be gradual. Nothing rash," warned Buxton, "nothing rapid, nothing abrupt, nothing bearing any feature of violence. Above all, slavery would never be abolished. It will subside. It will decline. It will expire. It will, as it were, burn itself down into its sockets and go out. We shall leave it gently to decay, slowly, silently, almost imperceptibly, to die away and to be forgotten." That's one of the abolitionists wrote that. So they never wanted to give us emancipation or to abolish slavery. So they did it gradually. So enslavement was supposed to just, die away. We know it never died away because we're still enslaved. So systematic colonialism would prove to be an extension of the greed of those imperial countries and brought with it corruption, extermination, and genocide. And I say genocide not in terms of the original inhabitants, because we know there was genocide of the Kalinago and the Tainos who lived in our countries. I'm talking about genocide of Africans in the West Indies. These harsh conditions were just ripe for genocide. And when I get down to show you the number, I can tell you now, that 800,000 enslaved people were freed at emancipation in the British West Indies. Yet, 15 million were transferred from Africa. Where did the rest go to? Yes, it's over 4 centuries, but how do you kill off a people, 15 million people, so that you end up with only freeing 800,000? So genocide, oppression of inhabitants, and submersion of the nationhood of the colonized country and continent. These are the matters that have always occupied the liberation of Africans and people of African descent for 4 centuries. I'm quite a comprehensive researcher, and one of the things that I came across when I was reading Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams was a gentleman named Edward Gibbon Wakefield, and I was wondering why Eric Williams would quote this man or even read him. And I went on to read about Edward Gibbon Wakefield. And he was a man who had lost favor in the British Parliament, and so they sent him to Australia, and then he starts to write letters in the around 1825 or so to the colonial government, called Letters Between a Statesman and a Colonist, where he starts to enunciate what colonialism means. He stated the fundamentals of empire that should be manipulated. So colonialism manipulates land, labor, and investment. You know, there's a quotation from a Zambian politician in the 1960s, which says, we have to be careful with our independence, because our enslavers will come back as investors. Very good quotation, because we've seen it happening now. And this man wrote, and I quote, "My fancy pictures assort an amount of colonization that would amply repay its cost by providing happily for our redundant people." So they were looking to get rid of their useless people. By improving, and you know there's a lot of useless people they send down, by improving the state of those who remained at home, by supplying us largely with food and the raw materials of manufacture, and you understand why they don't want to give up Africa, and by gratifying our best feeling of national pride. So they feel very good that they have created empire through the extension over unoccupied parts of the earth. Mind you, there were people there, of a nationality truly British in language, religion, laws, institutions, and attachment to the empire. There are many of us who still do not want to detach from that empire. And in the 1830s, he documents the art of colonization. And it is that act on which the colonization society would be founded. Sisters and brothers, we pretend that these things are in the past, but forget that the call for France to militarily recolonize Africa was made just a few months ago by one of the generals. It is present and real. In addition, they have been brazen in their recent calls for reoccupation of Africa. Both Eric Prince and Elon Musk have called for the United States to take over Africa. According to Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, in his podcast, Off Leash, the United States should take over parts of Africa. His rationale was that Africans were incapable of governing themselves effectively due to corrupt governments and criminal syndicates. I just wonder if he remembered where he was from. As if corruption has a black face. Once again, he was espousing the racist, civilizing mission to bring order and development to territories they deemed incapable of self-government. Clearly, it is no coincidence that British politicians and ideologues were espousing these doctrines simultaneously with the issuance of the Emancipation Act. They had to ensure that the expansion, exploitation, and extraction on which their hegemonies were built would continue even with the decline of enslavement. I don't have to tell you that colonialism has been debilitating on our culture, mind, environment, economy, politics, and social sustainability in the Caribbean. The system is, and I say is and not was, is ubiquitous, all-encompassing, all-divisive, all-everlasting, unless we consciously try to decolonize. I reiterate that our liberation is in our hands. This is not a sleeping dog that we let lie and it will leave us alone. It reshapes itself and comes back to bite you as imperialism. You have to recognize the trauma caused by this terrorism that will continue with the extraction of wealth, domination, and control. Recently, we also heard that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of England, rejected calls for an apology on reparatory justice for the slave trade and imperialism linked to the British Empire. He refused to apologize for Britain's role in slavery and colonialism. The pride in civilizing other nations rhetoric was at the forefront of his statement, and he dismissed the role of Britain in creating strife in colonies, stating that no country is perfect. He spoke as if colonialism has ended and that they are moving on. Should we remind him that there are still colonies in the Caribbean? When our independent countries pretend to forget this region is still colonized, should we not also remind them that the Caribbean Sea is also owned by the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Americans? Independence movements in these countries have been stifled under the guise that they are part of some European country. It is argued that these countries are not colonies, but part of a family, a department, or part of a kingdom. There are even attempts to give their nationals the rights as citizens in these Caribbean territories so that they can vote and influence the outcome of elections. Is this not recolonization? Next, they will grant them independence, ask for a full seat at CARICOM and other regional bodies so that the Foreign Office can sit at the table of our leaders. Do you think that this is far-fetched? Look at what is happening in the French colony of New Caledonia in the Southwest Pacific, when Emmanuel Macron announced electoral reforms to give French citizens who live on the island the right to vote, further marginalizing the indigenous people. Do you think that this will stop with only one European power? On the eve of emancipation, an act for the better government of prisons in the West Indies was issued 3 days after emancipation in the British West Indies. It was intended that Her Majesty would ensure some uniformity in the regulation of her prisons. This would be replicated throughout the British West Indies. To date, throughout the region, Her Majesty's royal prisons continue to thrive. It had the effect of ensuring that the newly freed would understand that criminality would forever be tied to their race. At that time in Jamaica, for example, where most of my research has been done in this regard, there were 30 prisons or houses of correction and jails. Yet in 1823, there were only 3 schools dedicated to the education of the black population. Our freedom would forever be linked to prison and not to education. Reparations. Make no mistake, what really swayed the planters towards emancipation was firstly the offer of compensation of £20 million that the British taxpayer finished paying in 2015. We're in 2024. They finished paying the loan that they took to pay the planters in 2015. It means that all of your relatives who went to England after the Second World War also paid their own compensation. The second thing they gave to them was something called an apprenticeship period, which was just another form of slavery, because you had to work 40-something hours a week, free, and then you could work on your own little piece of land. And then, in some cases, you still had to share your profits with the planters. The listing of those who filed for compensation can be found in the accounts of slave compensation claims for the colonies, and you can look it up. of Jamaica, Antigua, Honduras, St. Christopher, Grenada, Dominica, Nevis, the Virgin Islands, St. Lucia, British Guyana, Montserrat, Bermuda, Bahamas, Tobago, St. Vincent, Trinidad, Barbados, Mauritius, Cape of Good Hope, all published by the House of Commons. In 1834, 8,722 enslaved persons were freed in Nevis. The rate of compensation per enslaved was 17 pounds, 2 shillings, and 17 and a quarter pence. The slave owners in Nevis received a total compensation of 33,073 pounds under the Slave Compensation Act of 1837. In the report on reparations for transatlantic chattel slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean, also called the Brattle Report, published in June 2023, and that is also on the internet. You can download it, and it has all of the figures that you would want to see. There's a summary of quantified reparations by destination and enslaving country based on a 2.5% interest rate. And so to St. Kitts and Nevis, the amount that they say is owed is $1,622 billion. So you can have a look at it and decide whether or not you think that this is a true reflection. I have done other lectures on it, and I think that it's an understatement. 2.5%, as I was telling them last night in St. Kitts. They have nowhere you can borrow money for 2.5% interest. 6 and 7%, 8 and 9%. 2.5 is too low. So what then is reparations? And how is it linked to emancipation and decolonization and liberation? Reparations recognizes the critical importance of addressing the legacy of colonialism and the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and many prominent global challenges that have impacted our right to enjoy all of the human rights granted to any other race. You know, Marcus Garvey said it very well. He said that there is not a more hated race in the world. No other race in the world wants to be from Africa. The call for reparatory justice for the 4 decades of the inhumanity of enslavement and its concomitant legacy of global systemic suppression is at the heart of repairing the damage heaped on people of African descent by a racist criminal colonial enterprise that remains intent on continued denial of the humanity of Africa and its progeny. The brutality of the enterprise that imposed physical, social, economic, and psychological damage on the humanity of Africans in Africa, on slave ships in the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in the United States, and in Europe, must atone for its creation of an unjust and unequal system that continues to deny its culpability. The impact is manifested in the intergenerational trauma that transcends the past, and the healing process must commence with the recognition of the culpability of colonial governments and the public enterprises. There's little about slavery that was not traumatic. The loss of culture, home, kin, attendant sense of self, the destruction of families through sale of fathers, mothers, and offspring, physical abuse, or even the witnessing of slaves being castrated and or raped. People of African descent, therefore, cannot continue to accept a civilization which tells them that all other races are entitled to payment for their oppression but that they are not human enough to merit the same treatment, that they must accept hollow, empty apologies and not ask for the outstanding back pay of their forefathers. And most of you have heard about the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice, and this includes a full and formal apology, Indigenous Peoples Development Program, funding for repatriation to Africa, the establishment of cultural institutions and the return of cultural heritage, assistance in remedying the public health crisis, education programs, and I'm not saying education programs, I'm saying a total decolonization of the education system, the enhancement of historical and cultural knowledge and knowledge exchanges, psychological rehabilitation as a result of the transmission of trauma, the right to development through the use of technology, debt cancellation, and monetary compensation. One of the things that I do when I go to any country to do a lecture on reparations that involves reparation is to call some of the names, and I have some of the names of the enslaved from this country, so that it is a mark of respect to your ancestors. And so, I want reparations for Limerick, who evaded execution. I want reparations for that unnamed Negro woman who allegedly poisoned the plantation owner. For the unnamed male slave who had burnt down the house of Elizabeth Neal. I want reparations from the Belmont estate for 16-month-old Job, they enslaved our children too. John Hanley, a 30-year-old enslaved man born in Nevis. Polly, a 38-year-old African woman. From the Hamilton and Brown estate, Joe, the first son of Nancy, who was 4 months old. 43-year-old Jane, who had just been purchased from another plantation. 19-year-old Belvie, who was also purchased from the Bennetts. From Anne Bennett, that's one of the things I also realized about Nevis. Quite apart from the few large plantations, there were a lot of individuals who owned enslaved people around their homes to work in their gardens, etc. And a lot of them were female. A lot of these slave owners in Nevis were female. So, Anne Bennett, who had Gustavo, a 32-year-old from Africa, 1-year-old Rosanna, and Savannah, who was 12 years old. From Jessima Bridgewater, who had inherited from Frances Bridgewater, Nanny, a 60-year-old woman born in Nevis. A 60-year-old woman born in Nevis. She was a slave from the time she was born. Ina, a 55-year-old woman from Dominica. That one was very interesting to me. That in Nevis, there was a Dominican enslaved woman. Hector, a 33-year-old African man. From John Burke, who sold to Anne Bennett, 2-year-old James, 2-year-old Clement, and 9-year-old Monica. Took them from their parents and sold them to somebody else. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you that there is no timeline on racism, which is a legacy of enslavement, colonialism, which is an inhumanity that has been perpetuated on people of African descent in the past, in the present, and they are consolidating for the future. It means that the fight for our liberation must be continuous and conscious. I want you to know that you are not the children of enslaved persons, that you are the children of freedom fighters, and as such, we must demand the restructuring of our freedom within a global framework that embraces reparations. We were the first global commodity, and we have a moral responsibility to lodge this legal claim in order to bring to justice all former colonial countries responsible for native genocide and African enslavement. Former colonial powers that are also guilty of prolonging the relics of enslavement through systemic and institutional racism. Let me leave you with a quote from the American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. He reminds us that, and I quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and never will. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. We have endured, and now we demand." I thank you.
Yes, definitely. Let's give another round of applause. Wasn't quite a nutshell, but we got quite a lot. Let's move straight into some question and answers. I'm sure you must be. Carla is right here. Before I do that, sorry, just give me a minute. Because all that was said, and a lot of it has been agitated over the years. Rastafari, a lot of other freedom fighters, and some, maybe 10 years ago, along with other reasons, would have forced CARICOM heads of government to look at reparations real serious. And so, I think it was in St. Vincent, they all came together and decided, yes, we're going to pay some attention to reparations. You were at that conference, okay. And out of that conference, leaders of our countries were asked to go home, go back to your country, and put in motion, form national reparation committees. Get civil society involved and allow these persons to push the whole reparation movement. Education, agitation, the whole works. And so in St. Kitts-Nevis, we did such. Today, I want to introduce you to Miss Carla Astafan, who is the chairperson of the St. Kitts-Nevis National Reparations Committee. Let's give Carla a round of applause. And she, make sure she came over to Nevis tonight to support us. And yours truly, Ras Iroy, I'm the co-chair of the National Reparations Committee. Now, questions and answers. Carla, you had the first one.
Good evening, everyone. The question I have has to do with with reparations. And so, when you look at the UCL database, University College of London, I like to spend some time on it. And you look at all the names that we see here in our societies, both on St. Kitts and on Nevis. How do we go about tapping or finding those families? I mean, we have gotten one or two throughout the region. What are your thoughts on reaching out? I know CARICOM is looking at governments who were complicit in slavery, but those families, and we've seen some of those families coming forward. What are your views? Because we heard Pinney. I gave a clap at Pinney because Iroy's surname is Pinney. We have Athertons, we have over on St. Kitts, a whole, names that we recognize, places, when you call these names of places, how do we now, come and say, should we go to the Atherton family? Should we go to the Pinney family? Should we go to Green King, you know, all of these places. How do we go about that?
Thank you for that question. The first thing you have to ask yourself is whether or not the people who have these names right now are the ones who benefited from the compensation money. Because a lot of them have these names because they were on the plantations and they got the names of the planters. It didn't mean that they had any part in it. It did not mean that they had any part in it. In fact, their great-great-great-grandmother was probably raped. And then, even if they didn't have them on the plantations and they bought them from somewhere else, they would get their surname. And these surnames didn't come until later on, nearer to the Emancipation Act, when they started to keep registries of names. Because before, you notice in the conversation that I had about the 1630s and the 1640s, they were referred to as a Negro woman or a black man, etc. They didn't even give them a name then. It is only when they come closer to emancipation, when they realize that they must keep proper registries so that they would be able to claim, that they started to give names and to give surnames. In St. Lucia, there was a phenomenon where they called the enslaved by a physical feature. Their surname was a physical feature. So, for example, if they called you Mary and you had a broken foot, your surname would be Broken Foot to identify you. And in Creole, you know, you had a lot of these names. So that Peter with the big eyes, his surname was Gauzet. So you didn't have, I'm sorry, you see what I mean? And that is because of how they named people. So just because your surname is Finney or Atherton does not mean that it is your family that received any of the compensation money. You have to see where the compensation money went. And a lot of it, because once they got the compensation money, they retired in their rotten boroughs in England, became lords or members of the House of Commons, and it is their descendants who have now benefited from the creation of intergenerational wealth, who are coming forward. Those here have not been given that opportunity to create any generational wealth, which is why it is such a difficult thing for CARICOM, and which is why they are going after colonial governments, the private sector that we know, Lloyds of London, Barclays Bank, etc., etc. And now that the research is being done because of the awakening of people, especially people of African descent, going into the archives and doing the work, and you realize that a Gladstone was a beneficiary, then they are stepping forward and saying, my grandfather or my great-grandfather had slaves in Guyana or Grenada or in St. Kitts and Nevis. And so I would like to give you a certain amount of money, or put money into education or in community development and so on. I think to appease themselves, but I also think that they are in need of internal repair also. So that is their own process of reconciliation. I do not, however, think they should control our reparations narrative. This is our narrative, and they should not take ownership of it. Okay? So it's not an easy question to tackle, because people will say, oh, but these people have this name, their grandfather, their great-grandfather. Yes, maybe it was their great-grandfather, but maybe because their great-grandfather was a racist. It's one of the things that when I looked at the Brattle report, I looked at the compensation that they asked for with regard to violence against women. And on the basis of, the argument was that if a female slave was raped from the time she was 10, and that happened to female enslaved women for over 400 years, that over that period of time, there would have been 50 million rapes committed in slave societies. So you understand. But a lot of the enslaved, because when they do the registries, they put whether you were a mulatto, whether you were from Africa, so you see Mandingo, or from the Congo, etc., or born in Nevis, and so on. So you have a deeper understanding of the complexity of slave societies. And mulattoes were also enslaved, you know. So how do you deal with these things? It means that we must have a big people conversation. It is time for us to have the conversation between the oppressors and those who were oppressed. And it might become confrontational, but eventually I think we will reach a point of reconciliation. We must have the conversation. It does not mean that we are going to stop asking for reparations, however. They must go hand in hand. We have to be given the opportunity to create the equality that we deserve as oppressed people. I hope that answers your question. I went far beyond. I'm just a very excitable historian.
I hope that my thoughts come across correctly. While you were speaking, it's not so much on reparation, but colonialization.
I didn't hear that.
Not so much reparation, but the colonialization of our societies, and that we're still struggling with that. While you were speaking, I couldn't help but think of the young people killing one another, and just how much the colonial enslavement mentality has affected us down the line with our young people wanting to kill one another, whether or not during colonialization and the enslavement, whether or not something was instilled in our ancestry that has created us down the line to become, I don't even know what the word is, to one another. The second question I have is, well, put the question out there, what do you think about that? And also, the second question I have is, why can't we as Caribbean people be more proud of our African ancestry? Just as some of these other islands call themselves BWI, why can't we associate ourselves with Africa? Africa, West Indies. You know, we need to, I know the Rastafarians are pushing Africa on a lot of the society, but a lot of us don't look up to Rastafarians. We need to be more proud of our African ancestry. We need to put AWI behind our names instead of BWI or French West Indies or whatever it's called, so that we can begin to become proud to be Africans or from African ancestry. I hope I made myself clear. Thanks.
Thank you. The two questions, the response to the two questions are connected. The first one about violence in our societies today. I am going to answer it the way that I see it, and it might not necessarily be exactly why. But I think that the slave society was so violent that for 4 centuries we only saw violence against ourselves. And to a large extent, I think we have internalized it. because of the fact that along with that violence, we were also being fed that we are not worth anything. As individuals and as a continent. So, as I told you, 15 million people came, only 800,000 were freed. Okay? So what happened to the rest? It is because of the violence against us in the society. They could kill us and get paid for killing us. They could separate our families. So we had no connection. Like that youngster that I spoke about, Job. He was sold to another plantation at 4 months old, taken from his mother. You understand? So they create a vacuum then. You have nothing to hold on to because this is not your land. This is not where you're from. This is not where you are from. You were trafficked here. So there is a vacuum and there is a longing because you don't understand who you are. Then, to go to Africa. For 4 centuries, this continent has been called the dark continent, the diseased continent. Anything bad you want to say about a country has been said about Africa, and Africa is not a country, it's a continent. It means the most diverse continent in the world. But we have been told that nothing good comes out of Africa. Why would you want to identify a place that nothing good comes out of? Why would you want to identify with being African? I get asked that question all the time. You know? So why would you? Especially if your education system has never told you anything about Africa before enslavement and the greatness of African empires. We think that our history started with enslavement. We don't understand where we come from. We don't understand what Africa is now. You have to go to Africa for you to see what Africa is now. For you to understand that there has been a sustained devaluing of the continent because they want to remain in control of that continent where you have the most biodiversity in the world. So if we don't want it, if they give us guns to kill each other, we don't have gun factories, yet we have more guns than anything else. You think that it is not something that is done deliberately? You think that it is something just by the wayside? And I'm not asking you these questions, I'm just I'm just speaking. And I'm saying that until we realize that it is in our hands to reshape the identity of Africa, it will continue to be like this because it is the Western media that covers what Africa is. And it is only now with social media that you are seeing a different side of Africa. A different side of Africa. I am not saying that bad things don't happen in Africa. I'm not saying that. Because even Africans fight with each other because of that sense that our lives mean nothing. We have been taught that our lives mean nothing. You see? And unless there's an awakening, a global awakening of Africa, and I mean Africa in its broadest sense, all of us in the African diaspora, then things won't change. Sometimes I speculate. I say to myself, maybe it's because we say Mother Africa. You know, most of the others call their homeland by father, the fatherland. Germany is the fatherland. Africa is the motherland. And I wonder if it's because, I mean, it's rightfully so because it's the center of creation. I keep wondering if it's because we call Africa mother that we continue to denigrate Africa. I speculate. I'm not saying that it's the truth.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
I was wondering if you could maybe contrast between two things, this reparations and this climate change movement.
Climate justice, yes.
Yes, because I am aware of things like the Green Climate Fund. And we know that it's the larger countries with the big industries that have had the most impact on the global climate. And they have decided, or I might be mistaken, but someone or some group decided that these entities would put funds into an account for countries such as ourselves that are more vulnerable to climate-related events to have access to the funds to sort of mitigate the measures of climate change. Contrast between that and reparations for me, please.
Yes, the two are related, but reparations is the bigger picture. Let me tell you, climate justice, which is what it's called now, it's reparative justice and climate justice. Climate justice has to do with asking colonial countries that have destroyed the world's environment through industrialization to pay for the impact of all of the environmental things that are happening to us. It is one of the elements of reparatory justice. It is only a small one. Because reparatory justice, how it relates to climate change, has to do with, and we don't seem to ever look at the historical part of climate justice. The fact that, first of all, our labor and our creation of wealth for Europe fueled the Industrial Revolution. Okay, that's one. You know, that's why there are so many challenges to climate justice, because they don't want to acknowledge that we're responsible for their development. Okay? Secondly, because of the fact that you had all of these big plantations on these small islands, a lot of us were forced to live on marginalized land, on the side of mountains, on the riverbed, close to the sea, and so on. So that when what they created is creating a storm out there and it comes to Nevis, landslides in St. Lucia rivers, in Dominica rivers wash away your property because of that, because of where you live. But it has a historical basis. It is because we didn't live on prime lands. We didn't live in safe places, you know. And so, climate justice is one aspect of reparatory justice. The other things to do with racism, colonialism, repair, trauma, etc., is a bigger picture thing. So the two are related, but are not the same. So I notice these days that climate justice is getting all the press. We mustn't let that happen. We must never let them think that the funds that they put into the climate fund, the Green Climate Fund, is our reparations. No. Okay? All right. I say what's on my mind. Hello.
Greetings.
Greetings.
I enjoyed the presentation,
Thank you.
and it left me with many questions. However, I think I have much of the answers. We have some serious challenges today in our societies. I've spent the last 7 months in Ghana, and coming back home, when I look around, you know, we have very similar problems. Not only that, but going to Africa, they look at you as foreign.
And we look at them as foreign.
When they come here, we look at them as foreign. And that is a serious challenge. Because the expectation that I had when I went there is that, oh, my brother.
And they call you a slave.
Our educational institutions
Yes.
are not preparing us for what is to come. Maybe you can talk on that. There's much more I'd like to say, but...
You are very right. They know even less about us than we know about them. And so it is not an easy thing. Africa has just started to speak about reparations. I attended the inaugural AU Reparations Conference in Ghana last year. And it struck me that Africans have not embraced the reparatory movement. And that is because Africans have been told and are ashamed that they were complicit in the slave trade. Oh, sorry. I was saying that part of the challenge is that Africa has not embraced the reparations movement because they, even within their liberation movements, because they have been told, and that has been debunked in many different circles, that they were complicit in the slave trade. So they think that they sold their brothers and their sisters and their children. And so colonialism, remember that colonialism was also very much alive in Africa. And so colonialism and the colonial education system that they received also told them, while it told us that they were diseased and lived in the jungle or in savannas and only wore, and walked around naked basically. They told us that about Africans. They also told Africans about us that we were enslaved people. You see? So it has worked on both sides of the Atlantic. The brainwashing, and so the need for decolonizing the education system on both sides is really necessary before there can be any embrace that will be sustained. Any embrace that will be sustained. And so it's not an easy path. It took 4 centuries. I am hoping that it won't take us that long to make the connection. But I want us to realize that we had better make the connection very fast because the liberation of Africa is again under threat. I think we have another question.
Well, I just wanted to is there any organization? How organized is is there any organization that can grapple with, I don't know how to put this in words, how organized is everything that happened tonight? Is there, how organized is what's happening tonight? Is there a central body that can develop this further? Or are we on each country?
Okay, the reparations movement in the Caribbean is organized by the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which then reports to a prime ministerial subcommittee of CARICOM So each of these countries have a reparations committee, like the St. Kitts and Nevis Reparation Committee. Then each of these committees are part of a bigger body called the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Then the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which allows the national bodies to do work like this, reports to the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations. And the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations feeds into the Heads of Government Conference, which takes it globally. So then the Heads of Government Conference will take it to the United Nations, where, for example, enslavement has been classified as a crime against humanity. We have now made it into a global movement. So it is not just in the English-speaking Caribbean, it's in the French-speaking, the Dutch-speaking, etc. It's in Latin America, it's in Europe, etc. So the Caribbean has been able to reignite a global reparations movement. Now that movement is a recent one. You have to realize that there are institutional structures that were in place before this current reparations movement, like the Pan-African movement, okay? Started long before in the 19th century, moved into the 20th century, people like Marcus Garvey and so on. Then you have the Rastafarian movement, which has been the most persistent and consistent with regard to reparations and repatriation. So you have a number of other bodies that are also involved. So we do come together to speak about these issues. For example, I'm going to the Pan-African Civil Society Conference in Brazil, and then to the bigger Pan-African Conference in Togo, still to come. But coming out of that, we had something that was very significant even before. We had the Durban Conference on Racism, etc. And out of that came a call for an action plan that articulated the need for a decade for people of African descent, for us to look at what happened to us, for us to monitor it, for us to evaluate it, and so on. And the decade called for the establishment of the United Nations Permanent Forum, a permanent forum advisory body, which I now chair, which is the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And so, and that is made up of people from 10 regions in the diaspora. So a lot of things are coming together and coalescing. The African Union, for example, has established something called the 6th region, which is its diaspora. So there are 5 regions within Africa and 1 outside of Africa, so that we can, as soon as they put things in place, we will have seats in the African Union Congress, etc., 2 seats. So a lot of things are coming together, and that's why I'm not losing hope, because it's not an easy task. But the biggest thing we have to do is the re-education of our people. That is the biggest one. I have charged the St. Kitts and Nevis Reparations as 2 nights of talking, my voice is going. I have tasked them with education. Educate the people of the Federation on reparations. Mobilize, have town hall meetings, get together with like-minded groups, and have these conversations, especially with our young people. In Jamaica, they have brought it to their preschools. They have created books for the little ones, so that the young lady who came and spoke about being black and being proud will have a lot of young people following her very soon. So we have to do the same thing in the rest of our countries.
Thank you very much. And on that note, even though I hate to, I would like to call Empress Naki to bring us the vote of thanks. It's very important that we acknowledge the persons and institutions that assisted us.
Blessed night to all. It is with great pleasure that I bring to you on behalf of the St. Kitts-Nevis National Reparations Committee and the One Love Rastafari movement words of thanksgiving. To the government of St. Kitts-Nevis and the UE Open Campus, 5 Islands, Antigua, we say thank you for sponsoring tonight's event, for taking care of accommodations and traveling, as well as of her food. Our special speaker for tonight, Miss Dr. June Soomer. To the Department of Community Development, and more so to Leander Cornelius for the complimentary use of the center, setting up and decoration. To the Oali Beach Hotel, as well as the Pottery House, St. Kitts, and One Love Rastafari movement. A big thank you for your assistance and contribution for tonight's event. We really appreciate it. To our media house, NNC, for broadcasting tonight's lecture, and to Judith Dayson for streaming it live, we say thank you, thank you, thank you. To Ras Marcus, Princess Kajne, better known as Star, and Ras Bingi for opening tonight's on a positive note. Thank you. To a special queen, J.D. Keynes, for introducing our guest speaker for tonight, a job well done. To our special guest speaker, Miss June Soomer, we say thank you for accepting, first of all, our invitation to present tonight, as well as for presenting such an informative presentation, an eye-opening presentation as well. You are doing a great job. Awesome, I would say. Your knowledge, passion, and dedication truly brought the spirit of African liberation to life. Thank you so much. And to our beautiful sisters and brothers tonight, both listening and viewing audience, a special thank you for your support, for coming on, coming out, and staying with us. Thank you so much. A blessed night to all.
And allow me to thank the person who brought us the vote of thanks. Thanks you. Thanks be to you, Naki. All right, that brings us to the end, almost to the end. Just before you leave, we have some lovely refreshments for you. It's good food, ITEL food. Please don't leave until you get some. One love. So, oh yeah, Marcus, come forward, let me close it off in grand style, you know. So please feel free, and Empress Shelley would set you with some refreshments.